So, you have app.get, and again, you're just going to the index. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at the routes, and we have that routes in the folder, and it's going to basically call that function, right?
So what's happening here is routes is as a module. So if you open up the folder, any folder in Node can be considered a module. And if you go to the top of that file, you'll notice that we're requiring this folder called routes. So right at the top, you'll see it right there. That is the folder that we're requiring, and we're requiring the module user as well. Right. So when you call require, by default, Node will get the index.js file. If you need to require another file in that folder, you can pass it the path.
Right.
So that's what's happening here. We're pathing the path to the routes folder. And by calling the require function, we're loading that code or importing it into our current app.js.
And so when we say, hey, when this route is found or defined, right, this string, whatever it may be, call this function, you can just take a look at this. You know that it's been declared here. And we're looking for something that's been exported on it called index, a function of some sort. So the beauty of this is if I look through this, and if you've set this up and I go through this, I can start to see where things are pathed. And now you're separating out your logic, you're separating out all the concerns, right? And so things start to become very organized. And so I can go into this index.js, and it's just that whole module and exports idea that we've seen across the board, and many other things. And you see, what are you exporting from this kind of module? It's this function that's called index. And so this is what should happen, when I hit that kind of home page or that index page, right? If we look at the routes for user, there we go. Thought for a second doing a switch, I was like, you can see something, different might happen. Now again, we're only exporting here one function, but you could have a list of things. So you could have anything to do with users, right? Anything to do with users, whether you're modifying, getting a particular user, you could put it all in this one place. And same with any, you might have another thing that's, users, and then has something to do with their locations or something along those lines. You might have a different file, or you might map it the same. So you tend to organize things. Routing kind of becomes king, right? Because you tend to organize, that becomes your kind of object domain, and everything gets organized in that way.
So one thing that I'd like to ask you that I noticed when we were looking at index.js, we're using a new function to send the response. It's render.
Right. So when you're using render, the idea of render is basically exactly what it says. I want you to render something back to the page, not send something back, not JSON. This is what I want you to do. I'm going to render, meaning pretty much render a template. And so you're going to look for that index template, and it's passing some data. And so the beauty here is that, this object here is, a JSON object that's any kind of data. And so that data is usually what your template requires or uses or needs, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to expect that there should be a title variable in that template, and I want to use basically this template. So if we go down to our views and we hit open the Jade, there is a title variable there, right? But you can start to see, and we're not going to go through too much about Jade and how this works, but you can start to, well, at least not in this module, I promise you it's coming, but you can see anytime you see these curlies, this is, an ongoing thing among templating. You'll see it in frameworks. It usually means that you're taking that and you're substituting it, right? So I'm going to take this title variable, whatever it may be, and I'm going to substitute it.
And I believe the reason they use curly braces is because in HTML, there's no use for curly braces.
Yeah.
It's really rare that people will even put curly braces in their text.
Yeah.
So it's
unless it's like a code block, which you're wrapping or something along those lines. Yeah. So you'll start to see, how those things start to get mapped out. So if you went back to here, you might have more variables. This might be a response from something else. You can start to see how it gets,
Maybe data
built
from
up.
your database.
Pardon me. Totally. It could be from anywhere.
Yeah.
And right now we're just doing something very, very simple. So you start to see how these keywords really matter. We saw JSON, we saw render, we see, all those kind of things.
Now, I like demos. I like to see proof that things are being done. So why don't we run this app?
Here we go. Okay, let me navigate. Let me close this out. Let me open up the command prompt again. Let me navigate to the folder because I couldn't possibly be prepared. 07, right? Tab. Here we go. Okay, so I see there's an app.js. Now, do you feel like there's a standardized naming convention for like your entry point into your app? Do you think it's always app.js or index.js or?
Now, some people like to use different names. In theory, you should be specifying that name in the package.json file.
Right.
Now, I like to use app.js because we are building apps with Node, so it makes complete sense for me, and it's typically the name that's used by most
very intuitive.
developers. Yeah.
Could have been like run me now.
Yeah, it could have been that, but I like app.js.
Okay, so first thing I'm going to do just in this folder, I've done it already, but I'm a little paranoid. As always, just pulled down this project. I'm going to install stuff. I just want to make sure that everything's good. Looks like it's great. So now I'm going to go app.js. Okay, awesome. It's telling me is listening on port 3000. So let's bring this up. No longer my 7001. Goodbye. Let's go to 3000. Let's see if this works. There you go. So I've got a basic kind of Express framework working. Now, we had users, right?
That's right.
And
that is the response that we sent back.
So you start to see that, you would obviously get something here that if this was going to, that route wasn't found. And then you can start to supply templates for, for those kind of things like a 404, route not found, whatever you need to do. But you start to see that we get, the basic routing that's in place there. And this idea, when you first kind of create your Express app, this is what you see. It's Express, it's welcome to Express. And the first thing you usually go and do is you kind of go and try to change that title or whatever you're trying to do, right? But we see that it's working and that everything's kind of running on port 3000. And you're off to the races with Express. And so in the next couple modules, what we're going to end up talking about, we've covered the basics. We showed you, I skipped ahead because I'm a nerd that way. I was like, yeah, let's just get straight to it. But we're going to kind of try to show you in the next couple modules. Basically, okay, you understand Express, you understand how to, put a route down. Okay, we're going to build this out a little bit, and we're going to work a little bit with the templating, and we're going to build out the UI. And so what we're going to create is maybe we'll show in the next module the application as it is, and then we're going to start just walking you through how we put it together and how we built it. And so it really does take the front end, the back end. You're doing going to Mongo, you're using Express, you're using Jade, you're using all those kind of things. Again, you start playing with Express, you can use other templating engines. We're just, using Jade for this thing, today, but you can definitely use other engines in terms of templating that you want. Maybe you're familiar with something else. A lot of people I know who are doing client-side templating, they like underscore or mustache or any of those things. Fine. You use what you're comfortable with. Jade does have a kind of different format, I think, a little bit than some of those other ones. So we'll walk you through that, coming up in the next module. And I think for today, I think it's about time to. I'm starving. So, well, I wish. But I think I'm starving. Actually, I really am starving. Anyone want to send me a pizza? Has anyone got the address here? So we're gonna start looking at some of those things, whether it's building out the front end or building out the back end. Might do the back end first, and walk you through some of those kind of things. So we're gonna take a break. Thanks for sticking with us for this hour. Yeah.
Hopefully you'll come back. We really want you back here.
We'll take a look at the chat room and we'll try to address some of those questions as well. So we'll take a quick 10-minute break and we'll see you back soon. Welcome back. It's Web Wednesdays. I do not have a pizza in my hand, although there was promise of a pizza being sent to me somewhere in the chat room out there. If you do have a pizza in your hand that you are enjoying or some other food item, because I like food, please, by all means, share it in the chat room. Love to see it. Love to live vicariously. yeah, exactly. Love to live vicariously through you. Let's just get right into it, because if you don't listen to me, you'll be listening to my stomach. It is just having a mind of its own. Building a backend with Socket.io and Mongo. So we're going to start now on to the chat application. And this is not your average little chat application, right? We're going to be using Node. We're going to be using Socket.io, Mongo. We've got Express. We've got Jade. We've got all of those key kind of phrases there for you. So we're going to start building the backend. And walking through maybe some of these technologies that you might be familiar with, you might not, maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't used extensively, maybe you're an expert and you're sitting back there and inhaling the pizza that I desperately want. So what are we going to talk about in this module to give you a sense of what's going to be covered? We are going to talk about WebSockets, which are, they could have a whole day to themselves, really, because they are just a crazy kind of technology that you can use across board on different languages. We're going to talk about using Socket.io to connect users, to broadcast messages, receive messages. That's how we're going to get that whole kind of real-time, send a message, receive it, send it back, that kind of thing going on. We're going to use Socket.io for that. We're going to use Mongo. So we're going to use basically, one of the document-based database to save messages. And we're going to, kind of go and try to figure out what were the last couple messages that were received and bring those back and start working with Mongo and bring it into our workflow. And so we're going to show you a lot of this stuff using Visual Studio and some of the tools that you can be using there to easily do a lot of this kind of working with these different technologies.
Yep.
So, let's just dive right into what are WebSockets.
Yeah, so a WebSocket, it's a protocol designed to let you do real-time communication between the browser and the server. So we're talking full duplex connections. And what that means is that if you look at the history of the web, it's always been a server-client architecture where only the server sends data and the client just requests data. But with the more advanced modern web applications that folks are building, ideally what you want to do is you want the client to be able to send data to the server without having to refresh the whole page. So lots of workarounds were invented to do this before WebSockets were made available. So you have things like AJAX requests. You had long polling that you could do. You get all these like crazy ways to get this full duplex connection. But now that WebSockets as a protocol has become mature and a lot of browsers are supporting it, you can just use straight up WebSockets to create a full duplex connection and that'll let you do some really cool stuff like real-time apps and chat applications right in the browser. So if you're wondering, WebSockets are fully compatible with HTTP and they use the same port number 80 that you're used to with HTTP. So if you don't need to worry about firewalls or anything like that. And then what's really powerful about WebSockets is that you can build this real-time client-server interaction with the browser and the server. And Node is especially well designed to do this, to handle this, because it's very event-based. It's event-based driven. So the minute that there's an event, you can handle it, and the server is constantly looping through all the events that are coming in. So an HTTP request will be handled, as well as a WebSocket message and all of those messages in a way that's non-blocking, so you can keep handling those, and it allows you to build real-time applications. Now, WebSockets is supported by several browsers, including Internet Explorer, which is awesome because that's what we're going to be using. And it's great to have this support in Internet Explorer. And if you're running IE 10 and 11, I believe you should be supporting WebSockets.
So modern browsers.
Modern browsers.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement to say. It's just modern browsers.
Modern browsers.
Yeah, we like to consider that. The one thing about WebSockets that's I think is really awesome is that it's a protocol that a lot of languages support, right?
Yeah.
So you can use them in a variety of different languages, which also means, taking it one step further, is that you can have different kind of applications or those kind of things talking to each other through WebSockets. So you could have, your node.js page talking to something else that supports WebSockets, like a Python app or something, a Unity game or whatever, those kind of things.
Yeah.
So because it is a protocol, we're going to show you it, working in Node.js, the WebSocket, that whole idea, you can start connecting anything that has, supports it can basically make that connection if you wanted to.
Now, we won't dive in too much into the details of WebSockets and how the upgrade happens to be able to enable your regular HTTP request to start sending WebSockets. We won't dive into those details specifically. What we're going to do, though, instead, is use Socket.io, which is this really awesome module and library that really simplifies using WebSockets so that we can build our chat application very easily.
Yeah, I think anytime right now that you search for WebSockets, it doesn't matter what language it is, they'll say Socket.io. Even though Socket.io, we think of it as JavaScript, they'll always be like, oh, is there a version ported to this for Python, for this for another language? So you'll see that term, it's almost like synonymous with it to a certain degree, right?
Yeah, so Socket.io, it's a very simple JavaScript library and Node.js module, so you can use it on both the front end and the back end. And it really allows you to create real-time, bidirectional, event-based apps. That's a big mouthful.
That's
yes, I know.
Mouthful.
Real time, we know. Bidirectional just basically means that it goes both ways.
Yep.
And event based in the sense that if you're used to events in Node, Socket.io simulates events on both the client side and the backend side, so you don't have to change from the programming flow model that you're used to. Now, it lets you also do these things really quickly and simply. And if anything, you could use Socket.io as a way to standardize WebSockets across different web browsers. Because as you know, different browser manufacturers will write and implement the protocol a little bit differently. With Socket.io, just like jQuery, you can have a neutral base for all the browsers out there.
Yeah, it abstracts all of those kind of differences amongst the browsers.
That's right.
Thank you for doing that hard work on Socket.io. Yeah. So we're going to be, looking at Socket.io as a solution in order to create real-time communication in a chat application, right? So I send a message, and you're, on another side, you might receive it, save it, whatever it may be, that kind of thing. So
that's right.
Let's look at implementing Socket.io to connect send and receive messages.
Yeah, so let's dive right into it. Now, the first thing that you want to do is actually add Socket.io to your package.json. Now, there's different ways to do that. We can do it in Visual Studio, call this install new NPM package, and we're just going to switch to my screen so that you can see me do this. If I right-click on NPM, here's my little install new NPM packages. I can see other NPM packages that are available. I can search for some. Now, there's a ton of packages, so it might take a while to load.
How many packages did we say again?
Over
I don't even remember.
81,000. I remember that stat.
Yeah,
over 81,000.
This is what 81,000 looks like.
Basically. It might take a few seconds, but it's okay. We don't need to wait for it. We can also use the command prompt as we did earlier. So if I open up my command prompt, you can see everything hopefully very clearly. If I go into the project node chat room, this is the project that we're going to stay on for the remaining modules, and that's the one that we're going to use.
Remained-ish, doesn't matter.
Whatever's left, okay? We're going to use this project.
However I can conjugate that verb.
So we're going to jump right into this folder. And as we mentioned earlier, we can just go npm install save socket.io, and I believe, if I remember this correctly, there is a dot. That's something that a little confuses me every once in a while. And here we go. We're installing things. It's going to do a few compilation things. You can ignore the messages. It doesn't really mean very much. But once at the end, we can see that it is installed. And the easy way to check that is if I go back into Visual Studio and I expand npm, you'll notice socket.io is indeed set up. It's ready to go. Awesome, cool. So that's the thing that you want to do first. You want to add it, and if you want to double check in package.json, it is there. And you'll notice we are using this version of socket.io. Hopefully it's the right one. I believe it is. But if anything, we can always double check to see if it did modify package.json and run this compare.modified. And yes, it did. It did actually change my socket.io version. Something that I just noticed at the moment. So if you wanted a refresher, if I wanted to, I can just go this, remove that, force it to use a specific version of socket.io, just so that we don't have any demo bugs or glitches in our MVA. So if I run this, it's going to tell me, hey, okay, node. It's going to socket.io, and then you'll notice right here, 106 is the correct version that we are using. Awesome, cool. So once we've got socket.io installed, the first thing that we'll want to do is actually go to our app.js file. Now you'll notice it looks very, very similar to the one that gets generated with the Express generator. The project in this case is actually generated through the Node tools for Visual Studio. So there's a bunch of templates that you could use, and you can go check those out when you go to File, New Project, and you'll see all those different samples. We won't go into it, but you can do that on your own. Now, you'll recognize a few things. We've got our Express require, we've got our routing, HTTP path. There's a new line here for Mongo, which we'll get into in a few minutes. And the rest is pretty much the same. It's actually exactly the same. If you look at this, it's the same thing that we covered in the previous module. Here's where it gets a little interesting. Now, if you notice, Express creates this app, right? And you can call app.listen, as we do in the REST API example. But in this case, we actually do want control over the server that we're using. So we're going to create the HTTP server ourselves. And the reason we do that is because we do want this server object back. So when I call this function, http.createServer, I can pass it the app, the Express app, and it will handle the all the routes that we've added to our Express app. But in this case, once I've gotten this server, when I go to import socket.io, I'm going to pass it the HTTP server that I want the WebSockets and socket.io library to attach to. That way, it'll attach to the same server that's using the same port, and we won't have to worry about different ports for the WebSockets. It's going to run in the same port. And what this function is going to return is an object that we're going to store in I/O, and this object is going to contain the WebSocket server. Now, this require line looks a little funky. It looks a little bit different than what we're used to. And essentially, what's happening here is that the exports variable is actually a function that takes an argument. So this looks a little bit different. If you remember, in our index.js, we had exports.index, and it was equal to a function. And this, in the case of socket.io, what's actually happening is that exports itself is set as a function. And if you notice, Express does something similar as well. So we can move from that. But I/O is still going to contain all of the functions that we need. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, server, start listening to this port number, and here's my callback. The minute that this callback gets executed, all it says is, hey, Express server is listening. Now, all this stuff sets us up for using WebSockets and socket.io in our existing Node app that we took from the basic Express project, Project 7. It's good so far. Any questions in the chat room?
Nothing so far.
All right. If you got questions, make sure you put them in the chat room. That way we can address them as we go along. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, all connections to my WebSocket, I want to track them. So in theory, when our server sends the file that contains our chat application, every single time that someone gets this, connects to our HTTP server and receives this application, we want them, we want to notify the server that a user has connected in some way. So how do we do that? Well, on every single connection to WebSockets, and we do that by going to io.onConnection, which is this event connection, this event named connection, and it's a standard connection. We're going to say, hey, give me the socket that just got connected. And what we're going to do, ideally, is send them all of the chat messages, not all the chat messages, but the last 10 chat messages that were saved in our database. And that's what this series of lines of code will do. And we'll get to that in a second. For now, we will just ignore this little line of code.
Just to go back, when you see that like IO on, that's a pretty like standard on this event, when this event happens.
So we're using node event emitters that we covered in the first module to handle the connection event.
Right.
And we're going to use that again and again and again.
Right.
So now if you'll notice that we're using IO object here, and it gives us a specific socket. So this IO object is for all connections to our server.
Right.
That's for all WebSocket connections.
Right.
But when we want to do something specific for a specific connection, we can use the socket module, and then we use the same event emitters.
Right.
So all the sockets are event emitters, as is the global IO object.
Yeah.
And in this case, what we want to do is say, hey, when a user is disconnected from our WebSocket, just say that it's disconnected.
Right.
Now that a user has connected to our socket IO server, what we want to do is, hey, we want to handle anytime the user wants to send a chat message.
Right.
So how do we do that? Well, the socket IO uses a concept called channels. So you can send messages on a channel. So if you're familiar with backend technologies like publish, subscribe, message queues, or any type of queuing system or channel system, this is going to sound very familiar.
Right.
And you can create as many channels as you want, and every single time that you create a channel, basically what you're saying is, okay, well, when a chat event happens on the chat channel, execute this function. So what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, socket on chat, any chat event, execute this function. And this function is going to take a message parameter. Now, this could be, you can call it data, you can call it whatever you want. It's the same thing. It's going to pass this message.
I guess that's a really good question that I don't think it's necessarily something that we talked about. Was just, you said, okay, you could pass data here, it could be a message. So if I'm going to use socket IO, I could be sending just a simple string, right? Like, hello, how are you? But I could also be sending more complex types of data, could I not?
Yeah, you could send binary data as well if you're interested in streaming binary information. Let's say that you're capturing webcam or video input of some kind, or even audio input, and you want to send that to the server. You can use WebSockets for that. And it actually it gives a really good use case that comes to mind. So let's say that you're building a voice communication app
that would send me a pizza.
That would ideally send Stacy a pizza.
A large pizza.
We're gonna keep saying this. We're gonna keep saying this till someone out there sends us a pizza. Oh wow, we've actually got one.
Wait, here. That's how I eat, by the way. I don't know about the rest of you, but it's usually it's a shoveling action. Oh yeah. Well done, Barry. Well done. That was awesome. If you ask, you will receive. Amazing.
We're waiting for that. So what's really cool with this WebSockets framework is that you can also send binary data. So if you're building a voice communication app through the browser, and there are ways to do that now with HTML5, which is really cool.
Ooh, HTML is growing up and getting fancy.
Awesome, yeah. So one thing that you could do is you could send these events straight from the browser without having to refresh the page or call the or do like an upload mechanism. You can use Socket.io to send bits of your binary in a streaming fashion. So you can even do like some event processing on the client.